I was sitting on a milk crate in a rusted-out single-wide with no running water, holding a foreclosure auction notice from the USDA, and that one sheet of government letterhead was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because by the time I was done, I'd mail my own daughter a framed photograph of myself sipping champagne on the porch of the farm she stole from me, and she'd be sitting in a federal prison cell for 27 counts of wire fraud and identity theft. The notice said the property would be sold to the highest cash bidder in 60 days, minimum starting bid $90,000, and I knew right then that I was going to get my life back for less than half the price she and her husband had tried to sell it for. But first, I had to help the SBA build a criminal conspiracy case while living in a trailer park behind a Dollar General with a colony of feral cats for neighbors. And I had to do it while the people who called themselves my family were actively trying to figure out if it would be cheaper to pay me off or to wait for me to die. My name is Margaret Corbin, Maggie to everyone who matters, and for 27 years I taught 3rd grade at Hartwood Elementary in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana. I balanced the school's activity budget by hand every quarter because I liked numbers that added up on the first try, and I could spot a miscalculation from 3 columns away before the principal could even find his calculator. That meant I'd learned to read a general ledger the way some people read a recipe, scanning for off-smelling entries and rounding errors that told a story someone was trying to hide. Once, I flagged a missing $1 too, $300 from the Fall Carnival Fund, just by noticing that the popcorn machine rental invoice had been duplicated with a slightly altered vendor name, and I traced it to a PTA treasurer who'd been siphoning cash into a personal PayPal account for 6 months. That skill became my actual weapon, later on, but back then, it was just something I did to keep the Valentine's Day parties from going overboard on pink streamers. I grew up in Picayune, Mississippi, where my father owned a small locksmith shop on Highway 11. I spent every summer from age 9 to 16 handing him tension wrenches and learning to rake open quicksets faster than the sheriff's deputy who came by for coffee on his rounds. He'd say, "Maggie, a lock is just a puzzle with moving parts. If you can subtract the pins, you can open anything." I never thought I'd use that knowledge outside of helping him rekey the church basement, but life has a funny sense of irony. Harold, my husband, had been an architect, the quiet kind who spent his Sundays drafting in pencil while I graded spelling tests on the couch next to him. He designed half the public library renovations in the parish, all clean lines and natural light, and he always said a good building needed a hidden spine, something that held the weight without anyone ever noticing. He died 6 months before any of this started, pancreatic cancer, that moved so fast the hospice nurse barely had time to finish her paperwork. Harold left me a letter inside a wooden box I didn't find until the day after his funeral, and that letter saved me even though I ignored it for way too long. The afternoon after the burial, my daughter Chloe and her husband Jared showed up at the house before the casserole dishes were even returned to the neighbors. I was sitting in Harold's reading chair, still wearing the black dress I'd worn to the graveside, and my feet were swollen inside shoes I should have taken off hours earlier. The funeral had been a small affair at St. Joseph's, with Father Paul reciting the same verses he'd used for my own mother 20 years ago, and I'd held it together until I saw the mahogany casket lower into the red clay. Now I was hollow and still, and the house smelled like lilies and damp wool. Chloe was wearing a white linen dress and holding a clipboard with a leather folio, which should have been my first warning, and Jared was already on his phone in the driveway talking to someone about monetizing the asset. He used that exact word, asset, like Harold was a piece of depreciating farm equipment, instead of the man who'd taught me to identify every bird call in the parish. They came inside without knocking, tracking grass onto the rug Harold had loved, and sat me down at my own kitchen table. Chloe's lipstick was perfect, a shade called Barely There, and she kept patting my hand with her manicured nails while Jared unfolded a portable laptop stand and arranged his presentation. He explained that as my only child, Chloe was now responsible for my long-term well-being, and that they had a plan to honor Harold's memory while providing me with a beautiful, low-maintenance living situation. Jared had a stack of color-printed spreadsheets that he'd run through a binding machine, the kind of presentation that feels legitimate until you notice the assumptions are all padded by 30%. He talked about the Louisiana destination wedding market, about agritourism synergies and revenue per acre optimization, phrases that came out of his mouth like they'd been copied from a business seminar pamphlet. Chloe kept nodding and adding, "Daddy would have loved this," in a voice that sounded like a wind chime in a funeral home. I was still so hollowed out from grief that I just nodded and let them pour me a glass of sweet tea while they described a wedding venue business on a farm outside of Covington. Jared said they'd been researching the market for 18 months, that the industry was exploding, and that with my pension as seed money and Chloe's creative vision, they could build a brand that would book out 2 years in advance. I told them I didn't have that kind of money, and Jared smiled in a way that rearranged his whole face and said, "Maggie, you've got $250,000 sitting in the teacher retirement system that you can liquidate tax-free under the CARES Act provision for economic hardship. We just need you to authorize the withdrawal." I didn't authorize anything that day. I told them I needed time to think, which made Chloe's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the way it used to when she was 8 and I said no to a second bowl of ice cream. She covered it fast with a smile and said, "Of course, take all the time you need, but the property they'd found had 3 other offers and they needed an answer by Monday." That was a lie, I found out later, but at the time it felt like the walls were closing in. I said I'd sleep on it, and they left with the binder still sitting on my table like a loaded contract. I sat there until dark, the ice in my glass melting into a puddle, and then I got up and went to Harold's workshop because I needed to do something with my hands that wasn't signing away my retirement. The workshop was a separate building behind the house, a glorified shed with a corrugated metal roof and a smell that was equal parts sawdust and old coffee. Harold had spent 40 years accumulating tools and blueprints and jars of fasteners sorted by size, and Chloe had already told me that morning that I should clear out all the clutter so they could turn the workshop into a bridal prep suite. She'd peeked inside earlier, glancing over the shelves with the dismissive eye of someone mentally calculating square footage, and had said, "Mom, this is just junk. We'll hire a dumpster." I was planning to donate his drafting tools to the technical college as he'd asked, so I started pulling open cabinet doors and sorting through the chaos of his last projects. There were rolled-up vellum sheets of the library expansion that had never been built because the bond issue failed, a set of brass compasses still in their leather case, a coffee mug with a chip in the rim that he refused to throw away because it was the first gift I'd ever given him. I was crying quietly, wiping my nose on my sleeve, when I opened a lower cabinet that held a stack of expired carpenter pencils and old blueprints. Buried under them was a little cedar keepsake case with brass hinges, maybe 8 inches by 5. The wood felt warm and worn in a way that said someone had handled it often, and when I lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and old paper rose up like a memory. Inside were Harold's cufflinks, the silver ones with his initials that he'd worn on our wedding day, his father's pocket watch that still ticked when I wound it, a stack of utility bills from 2015 for a property I didn't recognize. Later, I'd learn it was a rental house Chloe had abandoned, sticking Harold with the final bills. And at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal with only 4 pages filled. The handwriting was his steady architect's block print, all caps, the way he lettered every structural note so there could never be a misreading. On the first page, he'd written, "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I couldn't protect you in person." The second page listed dates and small observations. Chloe opened a credit card in my name, February 2019. I reported it and she cried until I agreed not to press charges. She promised it was a one-time mistake. The third page said, "Jared has been asking about your pension balance. He framed it as just curious about the asset mix, but I checked his browser history, and he was on the TRS website looking up hardship withdrawal rules. They are circling." And on the last page, in heavier, darker letters as if he'd pressed the pen harder, he'd written, "Maggie, do not trust Chloe. She has already started circling. Keep control of anything with your name on it, and if you ever feel pressured, remember I set up safeguards. Call the number I taped to the back of the retirement bureau statement in my desk drawer." Beneath that was a single line I will never forget. "She will bleed you dry and then let you die in a trailer." I read it 3 times, my hands shaking so badly the words blurred, and I thought about the afternoon 4 years earlier when Harold had insisted we update our estate planning, saying he'd noticed some inconsistencies in how Chloe handled a small joint checking account we'd once shared with her. I dismissed it as paranoia then. Now, sitting on his workshop stool with the smell of his life all around me, I knew I'd been stupid. I clutched the journal against my chest and sobbed until my ribs ached, the kind of crying that leaves you empty and clear-eyed. Then I carefully put the box back under the blueprints, exactly where I'd found it, because I realized that if Chloe had already dismissed it as junk, she would never look there. I took the journal and the pocket watch and the cufflinks, leaving the utility bills, and I walked back to the house on legs that felt borrowed. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in Harold's chair with his watch ticking on the end table, and I read the journal again and again, memorizing every word, while somewhere in the dark Chloe and Jared were probably drinking wine and congratulating themselves on their imminent inheritance. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family isn't a free pass to steal someone's entire life savings. And if you've ever been told you're just being paranoid about the people who are supposed to love you, pay attention, because this one's for you. I wish I could tell you I acted on that warning immediately. I did not. Grief does strange things to your judgment, and when you've just buried your person, the idea that your only daughter is a predator feels too enormous to hold. I went to bed that night with the journal under my pillow and woke up with a stiff neck and a flimsy rationalization. Harold had been on heavy medication. He was confused. He didn't mean it literally. The human mind will latch onto any excuse to avoid the truth when the truth is unbearable. Over the next 2 weeks, Chloe and Jared intensified their campaign, and I let them. They brought over brochures for farm properties with charming names like Whispering Oaks Estate and Sunset Ridge Meadows, each one professionally photographed with golden hour light and staged with rustic props that Jared had rented from a prop house in New Orleans. They showed me projected revenue spreadsheets that Jared had built in Excel with color-coded columns and assumptions that assumed 40 weddings per year at $9,000 a head, even though I knew from my own teaching budget analysis that occupancy rates never hit projections in the first 2 years. But I was too tired to argue, and Chloe kept bringing over casseroles and calling me Mama, the way she hadn't since she was 12, and I wanted so badly to believe we were building something together. I remember one night, she sat on the edge of my bed and brushed my hair the way she used to when she was little, and she told me a story about a bride who'd canceled her destination wedding in Tuscany because of a volcano and was looking for a hidden gem in the American South. It sounded so specific, so real, that I almost convinced myself the whole thing was legitimate. The night before the Monday deadline, they brought a bottle of Prosecco and a photo album of the farm they wanted to buy, and Jared talked about the guest cottage, how it would be renovated into a 2-bedroom cottage with a wraparound porch and a garden view all for me forever. Chloe said, "Mom, this is the next chapter. You earned this." I cried, and she held me, and I signed the TRS hardship withdrawal request on my kitchen counter with a dying Bic pen. The form was a dense 3-page document, and I noticed that Section 4, Use of Funds, listed business investment in agricultural hospitality enterprise without specifying any ownership structure. I asked about that, and Jared flapped his hand and said it was just a category the state required, nothing to worry about. I signed. The pen went dry halfway through, and I had to finish with another one, which meant the signature on the form looked slightly different on the last page, a detail that would later become part of the forensic evidence. It took 3 weeks for the state to process my pension liquidation. During those weeks, I tried to see a lawyer. I called 3 different firms in Covington from a list I'd found at the library, but everyone asked for a $5,000 retainer. I had no liquid cash except the $42,000 in Harold's separate account, and I didn't know about that yet, because I hadn't called the number in his note, so I was broke on paper until the pension landed. The one attorney who agreed to a free consultation in Mandeville listened to my story for 10 minutes and said, "Mrs. Corbin, unless you have concrete proof of fraud, this is a family dispute. You signed the documents willingly in front of a notary. There's no case here." I left her office feeling stupid and small. The pension distribution letter came in a plain envelope from the teacher retirement system of Louisiana, confirming the wire transfer of $248,617. 42 to my checking account, less the mandatory 20% federal withholding that I'd have to reconcile at tax time. The wire hit on a Tuesday at 10:14 a.m. By 10:32, Jared was outside in his Ford F-250 with a cashier's check already drafted for the farm's down payment. And by noon, we were sitting in a title company office on Highway 21 with a closing agent named Patricia who smelled like magnolia perfume and kept calling me Mrs. Corbin, honey. The farm was a 47-acre property on Highway 1082 with an old Creole-style house, a horse barn with a collapsed roof, and a pond with actual crawfish in it. The asking price was $410,000, but Jared had negotiated it down to $395,000 because of the barn condition. He'd also lined up a USDA Rural Development Business Loan for $160,000 to cover renovations and startup operating costs, structured as a guaranteed loan under the Business and Industry Program. He explained that the loan required my Social Security number as the primary borrower because Chloe's credit score was still recovering from a student loan forbearance, which was a lie. In reality, the lender had denied her application because of a charge-off from a credit card fraud charge in 2019 that she'd gotten expunged after restitution, but that still showed on the internal banking matrix. I didn't know any of that then. I signed the closing documents while Chloe signed on a separate stack that Patricia briefed as entity formation papers and business account authorizations. The whole package was over 400 pages, and I only saw the first 4. Then Patricia slid a separate document across the table, a consolidated management agreement, and said this one was just a formality to streamline operations. I asked if it changed my ownership at all, and Jared laughed and said, "No, it just lets us manage the business checking account without bugging you every time we need to buy paint." I looked at Patricia, who was stamping documents without making eye contact, and I felt something twist in my stomach. I told them I wanted my own attorney to look at it. Chloe's face went cold, and Jared's smile tightened. "Mom," Chloe said, "the lender is going to pull the whole loan if we don't close today. We'll lose the property and your retirement money will be tied up in escrow for months. Is that what you want?" I signed. Patricia notarized it. The ink was still wet when Jared folded the paper and put it in his briefcase. Within a month, the farm had a fresh coat of white paint on the main house, a new metal roof on the barn, and a website with drone footage and an online booking calendar that already had a dozen tentative reservations. The guest cottage where I was supposed to live had 1 bedroom, no wraparound porch, and a window unit air conditioner that rattled like a dying lawnmower. I moved in anyway, because the main house was being staged for bridal magazine photo shoots, and Jared said my eclectic decorating style wouldn't photograph well. I didn't argue. I was too exhausted from packing up my old home and trying to find a lawyer, and every day I'd see Chloe out in the garden directing workers with a clipboard, looking like the daughter I'd raised. But at night, when I'd walk past the main house to get my mail, I'd overhear them arguing about money, about suppliers demanding upfront payment, about the old lady in the cottage who didn't understand business. I started noticing small things. The checking account statements that I requested from the bank never arrived. Jared said they were paperless now. The business license I saw pinned in the main house kitchen listed only Chloe and Jared as members. When I asked about my name, Jared said the county had made a clerical error and they'd fix it. I believed him because I was still half in shock, still waking up every morning expecting Harold to be in the kitchen making his terrible instant coffee. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, Chloe appeared at my cottage door with a man in a gray suit and a notary seal ring and asked me to sign one more document. She called it a Consolidated Management Agreement Addendum, said it was just an update to the original to reflect the new tax ID number for the LLC. I was holding a gardening trowel and wearing muddy Crocs, and I read the first paragraph, which said something about voluntary conveyance of any residual interest. I asked if this meant I was giving something away. She laughed and said, "No, silly, it's just tax language. The CPA needs this by tomorrow, or we can't file the annual report and the state will dissolve the LLC and we'll lose everything you invested." I asked if I could have my own attorney review it. Her smile vanished so fast I saw the muscles in her jaw lock, exactly the way Harold had described in his journal. She said, "Mom, we're closing on a $40,000 bridal suite renovation tomorrow, And if you delay this, the loan lock expires, and we lose the whole property. Is that what you want? To lose Daddy's dream? I signed the paper on my knee, the notary stamping it without even checking my ID. 2 days later, the quitclaim deed was recorded at the St. Tammany Parish Clerk's office, transferring my entire ownership interest in the farm to Chloe and Jared as joint tenants with right of survivorship, for the consideration of natural love and affection. That's Louisiana legal code for we took everything and gave you nothing. That Saturday morning, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my cottage door with a formal eviction notice and a stack of printed screenshots from the venue's social media accounts. Chloe had posted a statement saying her mother had disappeared with the investment funds and that they were cooperating with the authorities to recover the stolen assets for the business. The deputy, a tired-looking man with a stress-induced squint, said he didn't want to be there any more than I wanted him there, but the paperwork was clean and I had until sundown. I asked him if he'd ever served an eviction to a woman who'd been living on her own land 3 days earlier. He didn't answer. Jared stood behind the deputy with his arms crossed, watching me carry my grandmother's sewing machine to my Corolla while Chloe filmed the whole thing on her phone for liability purposes. When I asked where I was supposed to go, Jared tossed a set of keys to a trailer in a park called Bayou Breeze Mobile Estates, which had no bayou, no breeze, and no estate. It had a cracked septic line, a hot plate, and a single mattress that smelled like wet dog. I sat on that mattress at 10 p.m., with my cat carrier on my lap and my stomach hollow, and I finally let myself hear Harold's voice in my head. "Save yourself." I reached into my pocket and felt the edge of his pocket watch, which I'd kept with me since the day I found it. The watch ticked steadily, a small heartbeat, and I realized I'd been carrying his warning this whole time and ignoring it. That was the moment the grief cracked open and let through something harder and much, much colder. That night, I started my investigation. Not the SBA investigation yet, not the criminal referral. My own investigation, the one where I stopped being a mother and became an auditor of my own betrayal. I had managed to rescue my laptop and a single box of files from the cottage before the deputy came, including the fireproof lockbox Harold had bolted to our old house's floor. Inside that lockbox were my tax returns for the past 7 years, my Social Security card, a copy of our marriage certificate, and the retirement bureau statement Harold had mentioned. On the back of that statement, scrawled in pencil, was a phone number with a 985 area code. I stared at it for a long minute. Then I used my prepaid flip phone. I'd switched to a cheap burner when I realized Chloe might be monitoring my cell account, and dialed. A woman answered on the second ring. "Bayou Credit Union, Member Services, how can I help you?" I gave my name and the last 4 of my social, and she said, "Mrs. Corbin, we've been expecting your call. Your husband set up a payable on death account with a life insurance beneficiary designation. Would you like to come in and verify your identity so we can release the funds?" I drove there the next morning, a small brick building near the Tangipahoa River, and sat down with a woman named Evelyn who had hair the color of cotton candy and a disposition like a hug. She brought me a cup of coffee in a ceramic mug that said, "Louisiana Strong," and she explained that Harold had purchased a whole life policy years ago with a $42,000 death benefit, and he'd named me as the sole beneficiary with the credit union as trustee, structured so that the payout would bypass his estate entirely. "He set it up right after your daughter's credit card incident," Evelyn said, tapping her screen. "He told us, I need a box she can't open. He was very specific that it had to be a payable on death account with no joint ownership and no power of attorney, so that even if someone tried to get a court order, the funds would transfer directly to you outside of probate. It's a little legal fortress, Mrs. Corbin. Your husband was a smart man." I sat there with Evelyn for an hour while she processed the paperwork and transferred the money into a new account solely under my name, and I cried into that coffee mug until the lump in my throat dissolved. That account saved my life in more ways than just the money. It was proof that I wasn't crazy, that someone who loved me had seen the danger and built a life raft while I was still making casseroles and pretending everything was normal. Chloe and Jared had no way to access it because it was a direct transfer, a dead man's switch that required my physical presence and my signature to unlock. I drove home to the trailer with a cashier's check for $41,800. They deducted the account closing fee, and I tucked it into the bottom of my lockbox under a stack of grocery receipts, ready for whatever came next. At 11 p.m., that same night, with a single bear bulb buzzing overhead in the trailer and the sound of feral cats yowling outside, I opened my laptop and navigated to the IRS Gov portal. I'd used it every year to file my taxes, so I knew the login sequence, social security number, filing status, the exact amount of my prior year adjusted gross income from line 11 of my 1040. I logged in and pulled up my wage and income transcripts for the previous 2 years. That's where I found the first smoking gun, a Schedule C for a business entity called Corbin Lane Venue LLC, which I had never personally established. The Schedule C was attached to my social security number and showed gross receipts of 0, which was a dead giveaway that it had been filed purely to qualify for pandemic relief. It listed a business address matching the farm, a trade name that sounded like a bed and breakfast, and it claimed an employee wage expense of $56,000 for the first quarter and another $56,000 for the second, totaling $112,000 in payroll that I never received and never authorized. That matched exactly the Paycheck Protection Program loan documents I found next. I navigated to the SBA's public PPP loan forgiveness database, a searchable tool that lists every loan over $150,000, and entered my name. Nothing. But when I searched Corbin Lane Venue LLC, a record popped up. Loan amount $52,000, disbursed by a regional bank in Baton Rouge. Status, forgiven in full. I pulled up the forgiveness application, publicly available in the SBA's FOIA reading room, and saw that someone had used my identity as the 100% owner and sole employee, certifying that I needed payroll support to keep the business afloat. The application listed owner compensation replacement as the use of funds, meaning someone had sworn that I personally received $52,000 in income. I never saw a dime. Instead, I found later that they'd used the PPP money to buy a commercial refrigerator, a used party bus from a guy in Slidell, and a down payment on a timeshare in Cabo San Lucas. The next morning, I drove to a library 2 towns over in Manville, so I wouldn't be tracked by anyone who knew my plate, and I used their public terminal to pull additional records. I searched the Louisiana Secretary of State's business database and found the original incorporation papers for Corbin Lane Venue LLC. The initial report listed me as the registered agent and manager, but the filing date was June 4, exactly 3 days after Harold's funeral. I printed the page, highlighting that my electronic signature was dated the same day I was sitting Shiva in my living room wearing his bathrobe and barely able to speak. I also pulled the LLC's annual report, which listed Chloe as the sole member and manager with the effective date of the quitclaim, and a document called Statement of Change of Registered Agent that removed me entirely. Then I cross-referenced the street address on the Schedule C with the St. Tammany Parish Assessor's database and found that the property was purchased with my pension money and the USDA loan, but the deed now showed Chloe and Jared as owners. That was enough to prove the quitclaim had been filed, but I needed more. I called the bank listed on the PPP forgiveness letter, a community bank called First Baton Rouge Savings. I didn't say I was Margaret Corbin. I said I was a financial advisor named Deborah Lasky doing due diligence for a client considering a business partnership, and I needed to confirm the ownership structure and authorized signers. The customer service rep put me on hold for 8 minutes while she pulled the account, then came back and said, "The authorized signers on the account are Chloe Lafitte and Jared Lafitte. Margaret Corbin is listed as a previous member, but our records show she was removed on June 4. I asked for the date of formation, and she said the account had been opened on May 20, 2 days before Harold died. They'd already been setting up the structure while he was in hospice. I thanked her, hung up, and immediately called the notary who had stamped the quitclaim. The notary's name and seal number were on the recorded deed I'd pulled from the clerk's office, a man named Albert Finch who operated a tiny insurance agency in Slidell. I drove there the next day, dressed in my church clothes, and told him I was Margaret Corbin, and I needed to see the journal entry for the notarization he'd performed on the quitclaim. He turned pale and started stammering about client confidentiality. I held up a printout of the forged signature and said, "Mr. Finch, this is not my signature." You notarized a document without verifying my identity, and that's a Class C felony under Louisiana Revised Statute 328. I can report you to the Secretary of State's office, or you can give me a sworn affidavit stating that you never saw me sign this document." He chose the affidavit. I had it in my hand by 4 p.m., notarized by a different notary across the street, and it was a beautiful thing. Armed with that, plus the IRS transcripts and the bank call recording, which I'd made by placing my phone on speaker and using a voice memo app, perfectly legal in Louisiana's one-party consent law, I started the physical phase. I drove back to the farm that night, parking a quarter-mile down the road behind a grove of pecan trees where the sheriff's patrol cars never turned their headlights. I approached on foot through the back pasture, staying low along the fence line so the motion sensor lights on the barn wouldn't trigger. I was wearing dark clothes and carrying a small flashlight with a red lens that Harold had kept in his fishing kit, the kind that doesn't destroy your night vision. I knew from my months in the cottage that the security system only covered the front driveway and the ground floor windows of the main house, because Jared had bragged to a neighbor about the cost-efficient phased install that hadn't yet reached the back door. I also knew the back kitchen door had a deadbolt that was installed backwards, a mistake I'd noticed during the renovation walkthrough when the contractor had to leave early for a dental appointment, and Jared tried to finish the install himself with a YouTube tutorial. The upside-down deadbolt meant the screws holding the strike plate were accessible from the outside with a thin shim. I had a shim. I'd cut it from an aluminum soda can with a pair of kitchen shears earlier that day, just like my father taught me. Cut a rectangular strip, curl one end slightly, slide it between the door and the jamb until you feel the latch retractor, then pop. I slipped the shim in, felt the tension, and the door opened in about 40 seconds. The alarm panel by the front door was blinking green, meaning it wasn't armed. They'd forgotten to set it that night, or maybe the system had a fault and they just ignored it because the monitoring service hadn't been fully hooked up yet. I stepped into the kitchen, which still smelled like the lemon basil candles Chloe bought in bulk from a wholesaler, and I paused to listen. The house was silent. I unscrewed the battery compartment on the hallway motion sensor chime that I'd noticed during my months of walking through that hallway to the laundry room. With the chime disabled, I moved down the hall to Jared's office. He kept the door closed and locked at all times, carrying a separate key on a carabiner clipped to his belt loop. The door had a Baldwin Mortise lock, not a standard residential cylinder, which meant it couldn't be raked open with a simple pick. Mortise locks are trickier because the pins are oriented vertically, and there's a cam mechanism that controls the latch and deadbolt simultaneously. But Baldwin's entry-level consumer grade only uses 4 pins, and a standard hook pick can set them in sequence once you know the binding order. I'd spent 2 hours in my trailer the day before practicing on an old Baldwin lock I'd bought from a salvage yard in Hammond for $15. I had a pick gun from a locksmith supply website, $69 plus overnight shipping, and I'd modified the needle tip with a slight bend to fit the Mortise keyway. I knelt in the dark hallway, inserted the tension wrench first to apply slight rotational pressure, then slipped the pick gun needle into the keyway, 1 click at a time until I felt each pin set. The first pin was binding, so I raked it up until I felt the click. Then the second, the third, and the fourth. 4 clicks and the plug rotated. The door opened with a soft sigh. Jared's filing system was a disaster of manila folders with handwritten labels, and I recognized Chloe's looping cursive on tabs that said things like tax stuff and insurance crap, and one folder near the back simply labeled M. I opened it and found the original quitclaim deed on top, the notarized page still crisp, and underneath that was the consolidated management agreement I'd signed on my knee, plus a separate notarized affidavit of sole custody, where I supposedly attested that I was voluntarily gifting all my personal assets to Chloe to avoid probate. The signature was a clumsy forgery, my name written with a rightward slant that I've never had, and a loop on the letter that I've never formed in my life. My actual signature is a narrow, slant northward cursive that my 3rd-grade teacher sister Bernadette forced me to practice for hours, and this forgery was so sloppy it made me angry for its laziness. Underneath, that was a folder marked PPP application package, containing the SBA Form 2483, the loan forgiveness application, a phony payroll ledger showing my social security number, and a weekly salary of $2,000 for 26 weeks, and a copy of my driver's license that they'd clearly taken from my wallet while I was in the hospital visiting Harold. The loan officer certification sheet had a digital signature block that read Margaret Corbin in a generic cursive font that didn't match my handwriting at all. I photographed every page with my phone, using a document scanner app that auto-corrected perspective and converted to PDF, so the text would be searchable later. But I kept digging. In a lower drawer, I found the real dynamite, a folder called USDA Loan, with the original lender approval for the $160,000B and I loan, and clipped to the inside left cover was a one-page assignment of rents and leases that gave Jared the right to collect all event income and redirect it to an account in his name only. The account number matched a personal checking account at a credit union in Hammond, not the business account at the Baton Rouge Bank. That meant he was siphoning venue deposits directly into his own pocket before the business ever saw the money. Clipped behind that was a forbearance agreement that I'd supposedly signed, agreeing to indemnify the lender personally if the business defaulted. My forged signature was on that too, same loop, same wrong slant. Finally, pinned to the back of the folder, I found a desktop printout of an email from Jared to a real estate developer named Mike Di Gregorio, offering to sell the farm for $480,000, unencumbered by the mother's claim, with a closing date 6 weeks out, contingent on the buyer's ability to obtain a clear title after the resolution of the family dispute. The email chain included a scanned letter from a lawyer advising Jared that my death or permanent incapacitation would simplify the title issue, and Jared had responded, "We're handling the situation. She won't be a problem much longer." I read that line 4 times, my heart pounding so loud I worried it would trigger the motion sensor I'd already disabled. Then I took a slower breath than I'd ever taken, replaced every document in exactly the same order, and left the way I came in. Driving home in the dark past abandoned sugarcane fields, I felt something shift from grief into something cold and clean. I wasn't going to just fight to get my property back. I was going to make sure they went to federal prison for every single fraudulent keystroke. The following Monday, I drove to the SBA's Office of Inspector General Field Office in New Orleans. It was a nondescript beige building in a federal complex near the Superdome, and I walked in without an appointment carrying a binder with clear plastic sleeves that organized my evidence by category. PPP fraud, forged signatures, the email to Di Gregorio, the quitclaim, the bank call recording, the notary's affidavit, and the printouts from the IRS and Secretary of State. I asked the security guard at the desk to speak with an investigator regarding PPP fraud and identity theft, and within 20 minutes I was sitting in a small conference room with a woman named Special Agent Rita Mendez. She had short gray hair, a plain navy blazer, and the kind of posture that comes from 20 years of working financial crimes cases without ever slouching in a chair. The whiteboard behind her had flowcharts of shell company structures and a timeline of a previous conviction involving a fake meatpacking business in Shreveport. I started talking, and she listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Then she asked me to walk her through exactly how I'd discovered the PPP loan, and I described my IRS transcript search, the Schedule C, the forgiveness letter, the bank call. She nodded slowly and said, "Mrs. Corbin, did you know your husband called our hotline 8 months ago?" My hand went to my mouth. She opened a digital file on her tablet and showed me a case number and a transcript of a tip submitted by Harold Corbin in February, just after his diagnosis. He had reported suspicious activity by family members attempting to access joint accounts and had flagged the possibility of future loan fraud, specifically noting that Chloe had a history of financial deception and that he feared she would exploit any government relief program using his or my identity. He documented specific concerns about Chloe's financial history, including a dormant Etsy shop she'd used to run a payroll scheme for a side business that never actually sold anything, and he'd attached a copy of the credit card fraud charge from 2019 that had been expunged. The SBA had opened a preliminary inquiry, but couldn't act without a victim's direct cooperation. I was the victim, and now I was sitting in the office with proof. Agent Mendez laid out the next phase. She explained that to build a criminal case that would survive a federal defense attorney's challenge, they needed original documents, sworn testimony, and ideally a recorded conversation where Chloe and Jared attempted to get me to sign a final release for the property sale. The FBI's white-collar crime division would be looped in, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Louisiana would review for prosecution. She asked if I would be willing to wear a wire and allow myself to be approached by them with the release document. I said yes before she finished the sentence. Then she gave me the piece of information that lit the path to the farm auction. The USDA loan that Chloe had taken out in my name had a cross-default clause with the SBA guaranteed portion. Any proven fraud in the SBA application would trigger an acceleration of the entire loan balance, and if it went unpaid, the property would be seized by the USDA Rural Development Office and sold at a foreclosure auction. She checked the loan status already while I was in the lobby. Chloe had stopped making monthly payments 3 months earlier because they'd been dumping all available cash into the sale prep and Jared's online sports betting habit. The lender had issued a notice of default, and the USDA was in the process of calling the guarantee. If the criminal case moved forward and the lender accelerated, the farm would go to auction in roughly 60 to 90 days. The starting bid would likely be set around the outstanding loan balance, roughly $90,000 plus fees. If I could secure financing, I could bid on my own property. I told her about Harold's life insurance policy, the $42,000 that was now sitting in a credit union account under my name, and she nodded and said, "That might get you in the door." She also mentioned a rarely used provision. The SBA has a victims' compensation advance fund for cases of severe fraud, where the agency can front up to $48,000 against future restitution if the evidence is overwhelming and the victim faces imminent financial distress. "I think your trailer qualifies as imminent distress," she said dryly. I filled out the application that afternoon. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a full-time cooperating witness. The FBI field office in Metairie set up a covert operation based out of a nondescript suite in a strip mall next to a vape shop and a Chinese takeout, a location so ordinary that no one would look twice. I was fitted with a body wire that looked like a small fabric-covered button on my blouse, and a technician adjusted the transmitter so it would broadcast to a recording van parked within 3 blocks. I also had a secondary audio recorder disguised as a USB power bank in my purse, which I could activate by pressing the faux power button 3 times. We practiced my conversational responses for hours. Agent Mendez played the role of Chloe, using that syrupy false sweetness voice, and I learned to steer the conversation toward explicit admissions without sounding like I was reading a script. The key phrases I needed them to say included, "We need your signature to close the sale. The quitclaim only covers the initial transfer," or "You sign the management agreement voluntarily." The FBI also provided a small hidden camera that looked like a phone charger block, which I could plug into an outlet and point at a room, and that's what I used later for the medical scare. The agents briefed me on the arrest plan. Once I refused to sign and they made an incriminating statement, a tactical team would enter from 2 entrances to prevent flight. They showed me a diagram of the title company, blueprints borrowed from Harold's own archives, which Agent Mendez had pulled from a public records request without telling me ahead of time. I saw his drafting hand in those lines, and I had to excuse myself for a moment to collect myself. The medical scare. I needed to know if there was any shred of maternal feeling left in Chloe, not for the legal case, but for my own soul. I hadn't seen her in weeks, except through the lens of her Instagram stories, where she posed in the renovated bridal suite with champagne and a carefully curated caption about building a legacy from the ground up. On a Friday morning, I set up the hidden camera in the trailer, positioned on a bookshelf facing the front door and angled slightly down so it would capture the floor where I planned to collapse. I placed a document folder on the coffee table, a manila file I'd labeled Farm Ownership Proof in large block letters with a Sharpie. Inside, I'd put a printed copy of the SBA hotline tip sheet Harold had filed, with a fake post-it note on it that said, "Maggie, use this if things go wrong." I knew Jared's eyes would go straight to that folder before he ever checked my pulse. I rehearsed my breathing pattern for an hour, short gasps that sounded like agonal breathing without being too theatrical, and I dressed in the same black funeral dress I'd worn at Harold's grave because I wanted every symbolic weight in the room. At 3 p.m., I called Chloe on my prepaid phone, using the worn-out, defeated voice I'd perfected, and told her I was having a medical emergency, that my heart was racing and I couldn't breathe, that I thought I might be dying like Daddy did. I begged her to come. She paused for a long, cold second, then said, "We'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't do anything stupid." I hung up, positioned myself on the floor next to the milk crate, one leg bent awkwardly, and waited. When they arrived, I was slumped there, my breathing shallow and rapid. Chloe opened the trailer door without knocking. She glanced at me for less than 1 second, her eyes flicking from my face down to the floor and then immediately to the folder on the coffee table. She stepped directly over my legs to grab it. Jared knelt beside me, not to check my airway or feel for a pulse, but to reach into my purse and pull out my wallet. He flipped through it, pulling out my debit card and a checkbook, checking the account numbers while I lay there groaning. Neither of them called 911. Neither of them touched my shoulder or asked if I could hear them. Chloe opened the folder, saw the SBA tip sheet, and her face flushed. She said, "This is nothing, it's just some old paperwork from Dad," and tossed the whole folder into the kitchen sink where it landed on a dirty plate of cat food. Then she turned back to me and said, "Get up, we have things to discuss. The developer is pushing to close, and we need that release notarized by Monday." I didn't move. I let my head loll sideways exactly like Harold's did in his last hours. Jared stood up, pocketed my debit card, and said, "We'll be back tomorrow morning. If you're still alive, you're signing." They left, and I heard Chloe's voice outside say, "That old bat is tougher than she looks." The camera captured every second, every line, every indifferent glance. That night, I uploaded the video to the secure cloud server the FBI had set up, and I watched it in the dark, eating cold beans from a can, and I let the last ember of motherly instinct burn away entirely. The woman I raised was gone, replaced by a person who would watch me die and steal the receipt. I sat there until 3 a.m., and then I called Agent Mendez and said, "I'm ready for the final stage." Saturday morning, I dressed in a pressed blouse and clip-on earrings from my teaching days, and I put the FBI wire on under my cardigan. The technicians did a sound check, and Agent Mendez gave me a small, quiet smile and said, "Just be yourself. They'll do the rest." The FBI tactical team was already in position near the title company, disguised as utility workers in a bucket truck and a florist delivery van. I got into the backseat of Chloe and Jared's black Lexus, the one they'd leased with the PPP money, like a tired old woman being taken to Sunday brunch. Chloe kept looking back at me with a tight smile, and Jared talked about how the developer was going to put in a boutique hotel and a farm-to-table restaurant, and how I should be proud that I'd seeded a legacy. He used that phrase, seeded a legacy, like I was fertilizer. I said nothing, just kept my hands folded over my purse where the power bank recorder was blinking faintly. The ride to the title company took 24 minutes. We passed the turnoff to Harold's old office, the low brick building where he'd designed his last public library edition, and I felt the weight of his drafting box in my mind. The title company was a standalone glass building with a magnolia tree out front and a receptionist who offered us coffee. We were led into a closing room with a mahogany table, a notary public named Mr. Dufresne who wore a gold pinky ring and looked like he'd been doing closing since the Eisenhower administration, and a stack of documents 3 inches thick. The release form was the top sheet. Full and final release of all claims, interests, and rights, and consent to sale by Margaret Corbin, in consideration of the sum of $1 and other good and valuable consideration. Jared placed a silver pen next to it. Chloe was already checking her reflection in the window for her Instagram video. I looked at the document for a long, quiet moment. Then I looked up at them and said, in a clear voice that I knew the wire would capture perfectly, "I am not signing my name to a forged quitclaim, a stolen pension, and a PPP loan I never applied for. You two belong in federal prison, not at a closing table." Jared's face went from confusion to rage so fast, I saw a vein in his temple pulse. He reached across the table for my purse, and that's when the door from the hallway and the back exit burst open simultaneously. 4 FBI agents in tactical vests with FBI in yellow letters and 2 SBA Office of Inspector General investigators entered like a choreographed wave. Agent Mendez walked directly toward Chloe, who was still holding her phone up like she could tweet her way out of a cell, and said, "Chloe Lafitte, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, making false statements to a financial institution, and forgery of government loan documents. Mr. Lafitte, you are under arrest on the same charges." The notary, Mr. Dufresne, was so startled he spilled his coffee across the closing documents, which turned out to be a forensic gift because the hot liquid sealed the pages together, and no one could tamper with the evidence chain later. Jared tried to argue that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that his lawyer would get the charges dropped. But the lead agent held up a tablet displaying the email to Di Gregorio, the forged signature analysis report from the FBI lab that had been completed overnight, and a transcript of the recorded Lexus conversation, where Jared had explicitly said in a phone call I'd captured the day before, "We just need her to sign the release, then she's out of our hair forever. The lawyer said her death would be easier, but we can't be that lucky." That last line added an additional charge of conspiracy to commit murder for hire, though the FBI couldn't prove any concrete steps had been taken beyond discussion, but it was enough to hold them without bail. They were cuffed and led out through the back entrance to avoid the glass front, but a local news crew happened to be driving by covering a traffic accident and caught the tail end of the arrest. The story made the 6 o'clock news with the headline, "Wedding Venue Couple Arrested in PPP Scam," and I watched it from the FBI office with a cup of terrible coffee, feeling like the world had finally righted itself by 1 degree. The arrest was the start, but the legal machine moved slowly. The title company froze the pending sale, and Di Gregorio backed out within hours, citing the cloud on the title and the negative publicity. The USDA rural development lender issued a formal acceleration notice on the loan, demanding full repayment of the $160,000 balance within 30 days. Chloe and Jared's assets were frozen by the court under a prejudgment attachment, so they couldn't access any funds. The property went into foreclosure, and the USDA announced a sealed bid auction, with all bids to be submitted to the Rural Development Office in Baton Rouge by noon on December 12th. I prepared my bid with the help of a real estate attorney named Janet Fournier, who specialized in distressed rural properties and had been referred by Agent Mendez. Janet was a sharp-boned woman with a French braid and a mind like a spreadsheet, and she walked me through the USDA's sealed bid process. Every bid had to be on the official form RUS Form 440-24, accompanied by a certified check for 10% of the bid amount. I had the $42,000 from Harold's Insurance, plus the SBA Victims Compensation Advance of $48,000 that had been approved in record time, because my case was flagged as high-priority elderly victim. I also scraped together an additional $22,000 by selling my old house's remaining furniture, my grandmother's silver set except one spoon I kept for tea, and a small-term life insurance policy on myself that had a cash surrender value I'd never known about. Total, $112,000. I sent the bid package by registered mail on December 10th, and then I waited. On December 14th, a thin letter arrived from the USDA Rural Development Office. I opened it with trembling hands in the trailer, with the feral cats watching through the window, and read the first line. The United States Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, is pleased to notify you that your bid for the property at 22,810 Highway 1082, Covington, Louisiana, has been accepted in the amount of $112,000. I dropped the letter and sat down on the milk crate, and I laughed until I cried. The next week I wired the funds, and Janet accompanied me to the title company, a different one with a notary who checked my ID 3 times, and I signed the deed with a pen that felt heavier than any I'd held in 27 years of teaching. The farm was mine again, free and clear, with no liens, no mortgages, and no Chloe. The criminal case took 14 months to conclude. The U.S. Attorney's Office secured an indictment on 12 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of aggravated identity theft, and 1 count of conspiracy, and they stacked the charges so that even with plea negotiations, the sentences would run consecutively for the identity theft counts. The forensic accountant's report, prepared by a firm the FBI hired, showed that Chloe and Jared had diverted over $340, $0 in fraudulent loan funds, pension money, and event deposits into personal accounts, including the Lexus lease, the Cabo timeshare, and Jared's online sports betting habit that had lost $60,000 in 1 year alone. They'd also tried to hide an additional $28,000 in a cryptocurrency wallet, but the FBI's cyber division traced it through a Coinbase account Jared had opened using a photo of my driver's license as identity verification. Faced with that evidence, they both eventually pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft, with the other charges dismissed as part of the agreement. Chloe was sentenced to 78 months in federal prison, and Jared got 84 months, plus 3 years supervised release and full restitution of $290,000 to me, payable in monthly installments of whatever pittance they can earn after release. The SBA debarred them both permanently from ever receiving federal loans again, and the Louisiana State Board of Licensure pulled their wedding venue permits retroactively, which meant a dozen couples who had booked events and paid deposits received notices that their vendors had been shut down. The lawsuits from those brides are still ongoing, a cascading disaster that will follow them for the rest of their lives. And every time I get a subpoena to appear as a witness in one of those civil cases, I smile a little. While all of that was grinding through the system, I was standing in a field of overgrown grass next to a horse barn that smelled like raccoon droppings and old hay, holding a deed with my name on it. I had $41 left in my checking account, but I had the property and a vision that had been sharpening in my mind since the day I watched the arrest on the news. I reopened the venue under a new name, Second Chance Weddings. I refurbished the guest cottage into the 2-bedroom suite with the wraparound porch that Harold had sketched on a napkin years ago, a design I found tucked inside one of his architecture books when I was going through the boxes in the barn. I used salvaged cypress from a collapsed shed on the property and hired a local carpenter named Mr. Thibodeaux, who traded me his labor in exchange for a lifetime of free birthday party rentals for his 6 grandkids. I turned the main barn into a rustic chapel with reclaimed pews from a closed Methodist church in Bogalusa that were selling for $50 each, and I planted zinnias along the pond because Harold loved zinnias and used to bring me a bundle every August from the garden he kept behind the workshop. The first booking came from a young couple who had read about the case in the Times-Picayune and wanted a venue that stood for something real, as they put it. I charged them $3,000, and I cried when they said their vows under the oak tree I'd been eating cold beans under during the worst of my trailer days. On opening day, I took a photograph with a disposable camera because I wanted it to feel like the old days, when a photo was a deliberate thing you waited to see. It was a picture of me sitting on the porch rocker, holding a flute of champagne from the Dollar General grocery section, because that's all I could afford, but it bubbled just the same. I was smiling with my whole face, the kind of smile that comes from knowing the person who tried to erase you is now wearing a prison jumpsuit 2 states away. I had a copy printed at a drugstore in Covington and put it in a cheap pine frame with a matboard insert. I mailed it to Chloe at FCI Aliceville, the federal correctional institution in Alabama, where she began serving her sentence with a short note that said, "This is what a real second chance looks like. I hope you find yours someday, but this one is mine." I didn't sign it with "Love, Mom." I signed it Margaret Corbin, owner and operator. The prison mailroom scanned it, noted it as non-contraband, and delivered it to her cell block. I later heard through a cousin that she threw it against the wall so hard the glass broke, and she got written up for a conduct violation that extended her phone privileges restriction by 6 months. I sip my coffee at sunrise on the porch now, listening to the whippoorwills, and I think about how Harold's blueprints didn't just design a house. He designed the entire exit strategy I was too blind to see, and he put the key in my hands long after his own hands were gone. My father's lockpicking lessons, my own budgeting instincts, the dead man's switch of a life insurance policy tucked into a credit union account in another parish, and the hotline tip that sat dormant until I walked into the right office, all of it a quiet architecture of survival. Here's what I learned about betrayal and comeback. You cannot out-anger someone who has no conscience, but you can out-procedural them. Paper trails are a weapon. Federal loan programs have incredibly detailed compliance requirements that make forgery easy to prove, because every page has a unique identification number and every disbursement is tracked. The SBA Inspector General has a conviction rate above 90% once a victim steps forward and cooperates, because the evidence is almost always sitting in a digital database waiting to be discovered. If I'd stayed silent, I'd still be in that trailer with the feral cats, and they'd be in Cabo funding their next scam. Instead, I'm the person who bought her own farmland back at a USDA auction for 60% off, with a vengeance that tastes better than any champagne. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments, because the more we talk about what family greed really looks like, the fewer people will feel alone when it happens to them. And if you got something from this story, please hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. Every time you do, it tells the algorithm that people want to hear about ordinary folks who outlast the wolves. I'll be back next time with another story from the porch, probably with a better champagne by then. Thanks for watching.